look historically at an organization like UNRRA, which was established in 1943, it's kind of set piece of this new multilateral humanitarianism after 1945, seen as a kind of golden age for the first 2 decades from 45 to 65. It's an important story and an enormous amount of international goodwill, mostly US funded, where there are some 44 nations involved in this particular enterprise with the idea of binding the wounds of war. After the enormous destruction of the Second World War, some 50 million people had died. There was a will to actually think about the post-war settlement in one in which it was not about people as members of the nation state, but in fact addressing these particular figures as, in a sense, the figures or the representatives of a kind of aggrieved or victimized humanity. In that way, UNRRA sat at that particular project, and in its first few years it existed from 1943 to 1947, achieved an enormous amount under very difficult circumstances. In terms of the legacy, I think, again, it was never designed to be a long-term project. It eventually morphed into other things, UNICEF, a range of other projects that would focus on, let's say, children in the case of UNICEF, but other humanitarian aid organizations. What can be learned from it is, in a sense, to build on this huge international goodwill, the enormous amount of networking that went into this, to, in a sense, seeking donors, the media campaign that went behind making a case, which is not easy, let's say, for American taxpayers, that the war had wound down, the sense in which not only would American troops need to stay in Europe, but the idea that they would be committed to this enormous humanitarian project. Often that meant clothing and feeding former enemies. So that was one in which it was a tricky case to make. It was made very successfully, but with this idea that it would not be long lasting. I think contemporary humanitarian aid organizations should be thinking about how they can build a strong material and moral case for why humanitarian aid is essential and necessary. I think they can look to UNRRA and some of its successful campaigning to learn in terms of how they can reproduce some of that against the backdrop of an enormous war effort. UNRRA, of course, was for the most part a top-down organization. It was, in a sense, a very secular one. There were a number of people and groups on the ground in Europe and Asia in 1945, a lot of religious charity groups, Catholics, Protestants, Quakers, enormous amount of Lutheran groups, Jewish organizations. And so they were also there and doing similar kinds of work, though, of course, for them it was very much about the care of the souls as opposed to the care of the body. And UNRRA in that way is a very kind of secular organization, but it was one that was run, as its critics had said, in a kind of military command system. I think it was one in which UNRRA had to justify its existence to its donors by, in a sense, building a kind of model of efficiency. Well, I think anytime you can gather in a room a range of different experts from very different countries, causes, projects, that can only be good. We've certainly witnessed a kind of diminished importance and place of the United Nations in the kind of international political landscape. Anything I think we can do to build on what we know in terms of the historical knowledge, practical background, kind of experience that people have acquired in the field can only be, I think, profitable for all the people sitting around. And I think some of these historical examples, UNRRA being one, but there are others in terms of how, let's say, humanitarian aid moved from charity to development. The right to development became then a very, very important issue in the 1970s, and how it moved to different particular interests and concerns from the 80s to the 90s into the 2000s. So I think this kind of forum is exactly what's needed in terms of people then coming together to think about ways in which they may have to work outside the international system or work through it very differently.